Good morning and welcome to week 2. So in this video, I am going to spend a little bit of time talking about some additional things you need to know about the class. I try not to give everything at once. And I'm also going to talk about your submissions this past weekend regarding the podcast by Laurie Santos. So I am going to offer you a brief reminder that watching this video more than once is going to be incredibly beneficial to you. And taking notes as you watch it, probably each and every time, will also be ridiculously beneficial to you. You're going to get to the end of this 8 or 9 minutes. Hopefully that's what I'll keep it to. And you're going to remember the things that you were already primed to remember instead of remembering all the things you need to remember. So taking notes is one way to protect yourself against that very natural way brains work. And it allows you to figure out what your questions are when you go back in to watch the video again to see if I answered any of those questions. And then you know what to ask me because, hey, guess what? It didn't show up and you checked. So please grab a piece of paper and a pen and forgive that there's likely to be dinging in the background because I have found that my computer, if I mute it, doesn't hear me. And if I don't mute it, you hear everything. So people are emailing me because it's a work day. So I would like to start by doing a little housekeeping. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is kind of a strange thing for your English professor to talk about, and that is grief. Welcome to English 103. We're going to talk about grief. Most likely, you are experiencing some form of grief right now. That could be very, very interpersonal. You may have lost someone recently, either to this virus or in the midst of this virus. You are living in a world that's fundamentally different than it was 6 months ago and probably not appreciating the lack of control you have over all the ways your life has changed. And you are also likely experiencing some form of grief regarding the upswell in anger and violence that is happening across our country right now on myriad fronts. If you don't know the word myriad, you should definitely look it up, MYRIAD. And I just want to point out that while this grief is totally not an excuse to not do your homework and still expect a grade, it is real and it rests in your body more than likely, whether you mean for it to or not. And so taking a few minutes, even if just right now, but preferably every day, to be honest with yourself that you're working with an incredibly heavy emotional burden relative to just what 6 months ago it would have been like to be a student in a college online class will allow you to have a little compassion for yourself when things are not simple or easy and you don't want to do your homework. That compassion won't effectively translate into behavior. I don't want to do my homework, so I'm not going to. That's going to suck for you when it comes time for me to assign you a grade. But it's also true that that compassion will allow you to refocus yourself and be honest with yourself about how much work you want to put into what you're doing. If you are very grade driven, we'll go ahead and go there with Santos, then you are probably going to spend more time doing the work that I assign. If you are not as grade driven, if getting a C is good enough for you, then that's something to know for yourself as you're planning your time and approaching the work that I'm asking you to do. So, a couple other housekeeping bits. Office hours, come see me. I answer questions live, in person, looking a great deal like this, although my hair is not always this ready for seeing when I'm in office hours. If you get an email from me with a random question mark at the beginning of the email, or God forbid, in front of my name when I sign off, that is a function of Microsoft Office not playing well with Google Chrome. And I apologize. I've begged for years that we do something about this. I'm told there's nothing that can be done about this. And the only thing I can do is switch browsers from when I'm working in Blackboard, which works best in Chrome, to some other browser whenever I want to do email. That's just not reasonable when I'm working from home, which right now is always. So I apologize. I'm not being sarcastic with you to send a question mark at the beginning of Dear So-and-so. I am not in charge of whether or not that question mark gets inserted. It doesn't even show up on my side until I see you reply to my reply. And as an English professor, I'm horrified, but also I think it sends a weird tone. And so I'm sorry ahead of time and all semester long. I'm sorry. You're going to get weird random question marks in my emails, and I apologize. So, final housekeeping thing. The textbook. You are reading chapters this week from our textbook for the first time. And you're going to find that it's kind of frustrating sometimes. For one thing, I've offered you 2 different versions. You should only read the link version and ignore the PDF version unless you need a PDF. Now, why would you need a PDF? Perhaps you have a screen reader because you're limited in your sight. Perhaps you have a reader because you have dyslexia, and as you read, you get more confused by the visual nature of it than you would with auditory understanding. So there's lots of reasons why you might need a PDF, but if you do not need a PDF, use the link. It has functions and features that PDF does not copy over. So it has things like headings that say this is number 4A, and that's going to become important as we go forward. The textbook is also frustrating because it is not well edited. It's very well written. Dude's a genius. He's also an expert in his field. You know that because you've already looked up the author, because you know you should never read anything without knowing who the author is. And at the same time, that author was not getting an editor because he was writing a book that was free for you. So one reason that we read books that don't have errors is because those books have gone through editors. And that is an expensive process, which is why books cost money, one of the many reasons. This professor wrote a book that he offers to you for free. You probably jumped up and down when you saw you had nothing to buy for this class. And the cost of that is occasionally his editing is off. So he'll stop mid-sentence, or there's a grammar error, and it's driving you nuts more than likely, or it will continue to do so all semester long. Every time it does, tell yourself 2 things. Number 1, this book was not edited. Therefore, it will have errors. And number 2, this is how my professor feels when she reads my homework, because all of us have errors that look like that unless our work has been through a professional editor. That's just the way it is. So those are the housekeeping things. And now I want to move on to talking about your responses in the discussion board regarding Laurie Santos and the podcast you listened to. I'm going to start by saying that most of your responses were excellent. I loved the depth with which most of you approached writing responses to my questions. A good example of that is the very first one I read, Kimberly Wilson, right at the top. Lots of depth, lots of description, lots of evidence, not just here's what I think, but here's why I think it, and here's my analysis of why I probably think that way. This is exactly what I'm looking for in your work. That said, many of the responses you wrote to your fellow students were not very rich at all. They were, that's amazing, good job, thanks for thinking that way and sharing that with us. And while that's fabulous, that's the first sentence in like a 25-sentence response. It's not wrong to have that be part of your response. It's wrong to have that be the totality of your response when what you've been asked to do is think deeply about what your fellow students have said and respond to them deeply. So I'll refer you back to some of the documents that you read the first week of class that talk about how do you do a good response? What does A writing look like? And over and over and over, you're going to hear me exhort you to going deeper. So when someone says something you think is really interesting, don't just say, that's really interesting. Tell us why it's interesting, how you connected to it, why you connected to it that way. This is how we learn to start thinking about our own thinking. Instead of just shooting from the hip, this is what I believe and it's always going to be true and I don't even know why I believe it. This class is about learning to think. Why do I think that way? How does it impact me that I think that way? And so we're going to practice that in every interaction we have. An excellent example of someone responding with depth is Laura Wink responding to another student by saying, here's what I thought about what you said, here's why I thought it, and here's how I connected it to my own thinking about the same material. So that's me offering you examples from fellow students' work of what you're going for in terms of depth and understanding. Again, I'll reiterate that most of the responses were really fantastic. The one place things go off the train tracks is when we get to the question about what do you think I found the most interesting? And you need to think like me. I put think like me there as a big red warning sign. I'm not asking you to tell me what you think again. I've just done that. I'm asking you to think like me. And so where we go awry is in either not reading that well and in saying, most often because you've been trained to do so, I couldn't possibly answer this question. Yes, you can. And no one's asking you to be right. And so that's the first thing you have to put away. If you're going to learn anything in any of your college level classes, you have to put away this instinct of, I'm supposed to be right. And instead, think to yourself, the only goal is that I am curious. So you should be curious. What does your professor think is the most interesting thing about that? You're not going to get it wrong unless you don't try. So when you are thinking about it from my chair, looking at me, you've already seen my face. I am probably a white lady. I am in my late 40s. I am a professor at FLCC. And so you could go online and even find all the degrees that I have and where I earned them. There's all these things you can do to put yourself in my chair as you think about the thing that you just heard. So I'm thinking about the thing I just heard from my perspective as a student in the context I'm in, and you all did a beautiful job of mentioning your contexts over and over and over and answering my questions. But then there's also, what did you expect that the authors wanted you to take away in here? Now that's thinking about it from the perspective of the person who planned that podcast, edited that podcast, asked those questions, as well as the person who prepared to answer those questions. That was all very intentional. There wasn't anything accidental about that. They were making a meaning they meant to make. And so being able to think about what meaning were they trying to make and why is part of how we learn to think beyond the scope of just our own lives. And then there's the person who assigned it to you. What did I find most interesting? I had lots of great answers, and thank you for all of those. The answer is, I found most interesting having to consider how often our minds suck. Because we are sure our minds are telling us exactly what's true all of the time. We teach our children to trust this mind and what it knows and what it understands and how it's understanding the world. But our minds kind of suck. And there's lots of reasons why, some of which have already been alluded to in the posts that you all posted for each other when you were referencing your psychology classes. And we will discover more as we go through this class together. But the thing I found most interesting was having to really consider that I can't completely trust my experience of the world as a real and honest experience of the world. And that's just on the most basic level, not even getting into how my read of my experiences is context driven and privilege driven, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So lots to think about in this last 14 minutes. I'm sorry it wasn't just 10. And ask me lots of questions as you have them. Take all of this depth of thinking and make it your goal as you go into reading the chapter we're reading this week for Weapons of Math Destruction, the chapters we're reading in our textbook, and then melding those two together to do an excellent job answering with incredible depth and examples all the questions you have for this weekend's discussion. Let me know how I can help.